June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his aircraft return from their strike against Midway Island. Behind him, the controlled disorder of a carrier flight deck in combat conditions unfolded. Deck handlers guiding aircraft into position, ordnance crews moving bombs and torpedoes on wheeled carts, pilots climbing down from cockpits after flight. Morning sunlight flashed across the Pacific as 4 heavy carriers steamed together in formation, their flight decks crowded edge to edge with aircraft. By every measure Nagumo understood, events were unfolding exactly as planned. Then a radio operator stepped forward and handed him a message slip. 7:28 in the morning. The wording was brief, typed in precise characters. 10 ships apparently enemy sighted bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read it once, then again. Officers nearby later recalled that his face did not show alarm or shock. It simply became still, as though his attention had turned completely inward. For 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, the strike force of 4 fleet carriers, had moved across the Pacific like an unstoppable force. Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Salerno, Colombo. 2 British capital ships sunk. No serious resistance encountered. And now, during what was meant to be a routine operation to seize a small island, American ships were present where none were expected. 10 ships, Nagumo said quietly, almost to himself. His staff officers leaned closer. He looked up from the message. Where are their carriers? No one answered because no one knew. The scout aircraft that sent the report, a float plane from the cruiser Tone, had launched late due to catapult problems and had not identified ship types, cruisers, destroyers, or something worse. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. Signal the scout. Identify ship types. Maintain contact. Below on the flight deck, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga had just climbed down from his aircraft. His plane had led the Midway strike, 108 aircraft attacking American installations for more than half an hour. Still wearing his flight suit, he delivered his assessment to the air operations staff. A second strike is required. Enemy installations remain operational. That report created an immediate problem. When Tominaga's strike launched before dawn, Nagumo had held back a reserve force, 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended for ships. This followed standard doctrine. A reserve was kept in case enemy carriers appeared, but none had. Instead, the morning had been filled with ineffective attacks from Midway-based American aircraft. High-altitude bombers missing widely, slow torpedo planes shot down in flames. Nothing suggested an enemy carrier nearby, so Nagumo had made a decision. Rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for a second strike against Midway. That order had been issued at 7:15, just 13 minutes earlier. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews were already at work removing torpedoes, rolling them away to storage, and bringing up land bombs. It was slow, complex labor. And now there was a report that enemy ships were somewhere 240 miles away. Commander Minoru Genda, the gifted air operations officer who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in his cabin with a burning fever. He had been ill for days but had refused to be left behind. When staff officers brought him the news, he forced himself up on his elbows. "What types?" he asked immediately. "Unknown," an officer replied. "The scout is maintaining contact. We're waiting for clarification." Genda's flushed face tightened. "If carriers are present," he said, voice strained, we must launch at once, even if only the aircraft already ready can go." But Nagumo did not launch. He waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Akagi's deck filled with returning Midway aircraft landing one after another, deck crews rushing to clear space. A strike could not be launched with a deck full of landing aircraft. Recovery had to be completed first, and still the scouts had not reported ship types. At 7:45, a second message arrived. Enemy force composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief, immediate and visible, crossed Nagumo's face. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. The Americans had likely sent a surface group to intercept the invasion convoy heading for Midway. That was manageable. That was exactly the kind of target torpedo aircraft were designed to destroy. Except those aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. Nagumo turned to his staff. "Rearm with torpedoes," he ordered. "Prepare to attack the enemy surface force after recovery of the Midway strike." Ordnance crews who had spent the last half hour removing torpedoes and loading land bombs now reversed course. Land bombs were pulled away. Torpedoes brought back. It was just after 8 onwa. Midway strike aircraft continued landing. The reserve planes, now rearmed twice, sat in the hangars, while crews worked at a frantic pace. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered along the hangar decks, stacked against bulkheads wherever space allowed. There was no time to return them properly to magazines deep inside the ships. Then at 8:19, a third message arrived from the scout aircraft. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Appears to be, not confirmed. Nagumo stared at the message. Around him, the bridge fell quiet. Captain Taro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, stepped closer. "Admiral," he said carefully, "if there is a carrier present, we should launch immediately." "With what?" Nagumo replied sharply. "Half our aircraft are still returning and must land. The other half are being rearmed. The decks are full." He gestured toward the organized chaos visible through the bridge windows. "We launch a partial strike with whatever is ready, or we wait 1 hour, recover all aircraft, complete rearming, and launch a full strike." This was the decision that would shape everything that followed. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiryu, observed the same situation and reached a very different conclusion. From his flagship, he sent a message by signal lamp to Nagumo's command ship. "Recommend immediate launch of attack force." Yamaguchi was known for his aggressiveness. He was respected for it. Before the operation, he had argued that Japan should strike with 6 carriers, not 4, committing overwhelming force to destroy the American fleet in a single blow. Now he pressed for action again, even if it meant launching an incomplete strike. Launch whatever aircraft are ready. Get planes into the air. Strike before they strike you. Nagumo, however, was not an aggressive commander. He was careful, methodical, a man who had advanced through the Navy by avoiding errors rather than gambling on bold moves. He read Yamaguchi's message, considered it, and made his decision. Wait. Recover all aircraft. Complete the rearming process. Then launch a full, coordinated strike. It was the decision naval doctrine prescribed. It was what the manuals taught. It was what his experience told him was correct. So they waited. Midway strike aircraft continued to land one by one. Tomonaga's damaged plane touched down last at 8:30, fuel leaking from a ruptured tank. Deck crews pushed aircraft into position. Refueling teams ran hoses across the deck. Below, ordnance crews continued working in the hangars. The 4 carriers moved steadily through calm seas, decks crowded with aircraft, hangars filled with bombs and torpedoes. Crews working at maximum speed to prepare for a strike they now knew would be against American carriers that were somewhere nearby doing the same. At 9:18, the first American aircraft appeared. They were not dive bombers or high-level bombers, but torpedo planes. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet approached low and slow from the east. Japanese Zero fighters circling above dove immediately. What followed was a slaughter. The Devastators, obsolete, underpowered, pressed forward through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarming fighters. They released their torpedoes from too great a distance. Every torpedo missed. 11 of the 15 aircraft were shot down. The survivors turned away, barely flying. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo watched with grim satisfaction. "American torpedo planes," he remarked to his staff. "Poor coordination, ineffective." He was correct, in a narrow sense. The attack was courageous, but futile. Not a single torpedo struck home. No Japanese ship was damaged. If this represented the best the Americans could do, then Japan's superiority in training and equipment remained decisive. But the torpedo attacks did not stop. At 9:25, 14 more Devastators appeared, this time from Enterprise. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore into them. 10 were destroyed. Their torpedoes missed. Then at 9:35, 12 more arrived from Yorktown. The pattern repeated itself. Brave, doomed attacks that pulled Japanese fighters down to wave height. The combat air patrol was dragged out of position. Every gun and every pair of eyes focused on the low-altitude threat skimming toward the ships at masthead height. No one was looking up. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, rolled his SBD Dauntless into a steep 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed, splitting into two groups. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. Fuel running low, close to turning back, when McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. He decided to follow it. The destroyer was Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the carrier force after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. It led McCluskey straight to the carriers. Now he dove toward Akagi, and the Japanese did not see the attack until the bombers were already halfway down. On the bridge, a lookout suddenly screamed, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo turned, looked up, and saw dark shapes plunging out of the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. What he said at that moment was never recorded. The bridge erupted with shouted orders. "Hard rudder! Full evasion!" Akagi began to turn, her massive hull responding slowly. Too slowly. The dive bombers screamed downward as Nagumo watched them release their bombs. The first missed, exploding in the water alongside the ship, throwing up a towering column of spray. The second struck amidships, punching down into the upper hangar deck. The third hit near the aft elevator. Two of the three bombs struck home. Each weighed 1,000 pounds. Each penetrated deep into the ship before detonating. Below, on the hangar deck, where ordnance crews had been rearming aircraft for the past 2 hours, where torpedoes and bombs lay stacked against bulkheads, where fuel lines ran and aviation gasoline pooled, the explosions ignited a catastrophe. Secondary blasts tore through the hangar. Aviation fuel erupted into flame. Torpedoes detonated. Within seconds, the hangar deck became an inferno. Nagumo felt the ship shudder beneath his feet. Smoke poured up through elevator shafts. An officer burst onto the bridge, face blackened. "Hangar deck on fire, multiple explosions. Fire main pressure failing." Before Nagumo could reply, another lookout shouted. He turned and saw 1,000 yards to starboard the carrier Kaga, sister ship to Akagi, the second largest carrier in the fleet. 4 towering geysers rose around her. Then bombs struck. 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Kaga's flight deck vanished beneath fire. Her hangar deck erupted. Within a minute, she was burning as fiercely as Akagi. Then came Soryu. Smaller. Faster. Maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs struck her in quick sequence. Her flight deck tore open like paper. Fire poured out of her hangars. 3 carriers struck within 6 minutes, all burning, all doomed. On Akagi's bridge, smoke began to creep inside as the deck tilted slightly beneath Nagumo's feet. He stood frozen. An officer grabbed his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." "Lost?" Nagumo repeated, as if the word had no meaning. "How can she be lost? We were just—" He stopped. Around him, officers shouted damage reports. The fires were uncontrollable. The engines still turned, but fire mains had failed and aircraft could not be launched. Akagi had become a floating torch. Captain Taro Aoki appeared, his uniform torn, his face grim. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." "The battle," Nagumo repeated. He looked out at Kaga, burning furiously, and at Soryu, also ablaze. 3/4 of his carrier strength gone in 6 minutes. He turned back to his staff. "Where is Hiryu?" "Hiryu is undamaged," an officer replied. "She was separated from the main formation. The American dive bombers did not find her." 1 carrier left, 1 out of 4. Nagumo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiryu. She is to launch all available aircraft immediately and attack the American carriers." At 10:28, just 6 minutes after the dive bombers struck, Nagumo and his staff descended from Akagi's bridge to the flight deck. Smoke was lighter forward. A destroyer, Nawaki, pulled alongside. Nagumo crossed over on a line, hand over hand. The commander of the Kido Butai abandoned his flagship while she still moved under her own power, burning so fiercely that she could not be saved. From Nawaki's deck, Nagumo watched Akagi burn. An officer nearby later recalled that the admiral said nothing. He stared at the flames and smoke pouring from the ship, his face empty. No anger, no grief, no shock. Just a hollow stillness. 300 miles west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11 o'clock. He stood in the operations room as a communications officer handed him a message. Yamamoto read it once, then again. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. "All carriers?" he asked quietly. "3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu is undamaged and launching a counterattack." Yamamoto remained motionless. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, stood beside him, watching closely. Ugaki later wrote that Yamamoto appeared to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan against war with America, yet planned the attack that began it, now faced the consequences of his own strategy. He had gambled everything on Midway, on destroying the American carriers and securing Japan's defensive perimeter. In 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. "What is Nagumo's situation?" Yamamoto asked. "He has transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara. He is attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Order all forces to continue the operation. Support Nagumo with the main body. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, we may yet achieve our objective." But Ugaki could see that Yamamoto did not believe it. The admiral sat heavily and spoke little for hours afterward. Orders were given. Decisions made. The appearance of command maintained. But something had broken. On Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi received the news with a sharp intake of breath. He was on the bridge preparing to launch his own strike. 3 carriers burning, an officer reported. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Yamaguchi responded instantly. "Launch everything," he ordered. "Every aircraft we have. Hit them with everything." At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters lifted off from Hiryu. At 12:45, they found the American carrier Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs. Receiving the report, Yamaguchi allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now launch the torpedo strike." At 1:30, 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters launched. At 2:43, they struck Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. Already damaged, the American carrier lost power and lay dead in the water. To the Japanese pilots returning to Hiryu, she appeared finished. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Hiryu alone might change the battle. One American carrier, crippled. If another strike could be launched before nightfall, if the Americans did not find Hiryu first. But they did. At 5:00, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead. Yamaguchi looked up, saw them descending, and reportedly uttered a single word. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck erupted, her hangars filled with fire. Within minutes, she burned as fiercely as the other 3 carriers. Smoke flooded the bridge, reports poured in. The fires could not be controlled. Yamaguchi turned to his staff. "All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain." His officers protested. Captain Tomeo Kaku declared he would remain as well. Yamaguchi shook his head. "The staff will transfer and continue operations. That is an order." But he would not leave. These were his ships. 3 had already burned and sunk. The 4th was burning now. He would not survive them. As the sun set on June 4th, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sunk. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled the following morning. Kaga sank that evening. Soryu went down at 7:13 p.m. Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9:12 the next morning. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, and Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. On the cruiser Nagara, Nagumo sat alone in a borrowed cabin, staring at nothing. Officers entered and left, delivering reports, asking for orders. He responded mechanically. Witnesses later said his mind seemed elsewhere. At one point, an officer overheard him murmur softly, almost to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were coming?" It was the right question. The Americans had known because they had broken Japan's naval code. They had read the messages, understood the plan, positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, and waited. Nagumo had sailed into an ambush believing he held surprise, believing the Americans were reacting to him. In truth, they had been waiting all along. Every assumption that American carriers were distant, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still controlled the initiative had been wrong. On Yamato, Yamamoto received the final reports as night fell. All 4 carriers lost. American carriers still operational. The invasion of Midway impossible without air cover. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, he issued the order. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. Ugaki watched Yamamoto's face as he spoke. He later wrote that Yamamoto looked like a man signing his own death warrant. The war Japan had been winning for 6 months had just turned. In the weeks that followed, Japanese officers searched for explanations. Bad luck, a delayed scout plane, rearming decisions, timing, doctrine. But privately, another realization took shape. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida later wrote that Japan had assumed it held the initiative, assumed the Americans were reacting, assumed surprise was on their side. Every assumption had been wrong. The Americans knew. They waited. At Midway, the era of Japanese invincibility ended. The Americans had not simply won a battle, they had demonstrated that they could read Japanese intentions, predict movements, and counter them. Japan never regained the initiative. Nagumo returned to Japan in disgrace. Yamaguchi went down with Hiryu. Yamamoto would be killed the following year, intercepted by American fighters guided by decoded messages. But on the evening of June 4th, 1942, as 4 carriers burned and sank, the Japanese admirals struggled to describe what they felt. It was not just shock, not just fear. It was the sudden realization that everything they believed about their advantage and inevitable victory was wrong. Captain Aoki, rescued from the water after Akagi's sinking, was later asked what he remembered most. He paused before answering. "The silence," he said. "After the bombs, there was a moment when no one spoke. We stood there looking at one another, because what was there to say? We had just watched our entire strategy burn." That silence, quiet, stunned understanding, was what the Japanese admirals experienced at Midway. Not drama, not speeches. Just the knowledge that the war they thought they were winning had turned against them and could never be turned back.